Namaste. It is truly a blessing and divine grace that I have the opportunity to speak on this topic, spiritual foundations of Indian culture, on this very special day, the day when the Divine Mother came to Pondicherry, to be here permanently with Sri Aurobindo, to be a collaborator in his supramental yoga. On 6th May 1957, the mother had given a message, "Without him I exist not, without me he is unmanifest." Just as these few powerful words speak so perfectly of the oneness, the one divine consciousness that Sri Aurobindo and the mother are, they also speak equally perfectly of a fundamental truth of India's essential being, that of India being a Shakti, the power or consciousness of the evolving spirit in humanity. India, Sri Aurobindo says, is the Bharat Shakti, the living energy of a great spiritual conception. And then he adds, Mother India is not a piece of earth. She is, in truth, a power, a Godhead. The mother has also invoked the same truth when she says, India is not the earth, the rivers and mountains of this land. Neither is it a collective name for the inhabitants of this country. India is a living being, as much living as Shiva. India is a goddess as Shiva is a god. If she likes, she can manifest in human form. What a powerful reminder for us all to begin to see India as a Devi, a Shakti, a power who can manifest in human form if she so chooses to do. This is a fundamental truth forming the very core of Indian spiritual tradition, the truth of the one divine manifesting in as many forms as he or she or that chooses. Thus, one need not be surprised that this is exactly how the modern rishis, the avatars of our times, Sri Aurobindo and the mother, have described the true being of India. This topic for the day, the spiritual foundations of Indian culture, is indeed a vast one. So what I will do in the next hour or so is to highlight a few salient points, primarily in the light of Sri Aurobindo's copious writings on Indian culture that are spread over several volumes. I will briefly mention some of the great high ideals of our past that have given India a distinct stamp and identity. Ideals that have made India shine in her own brilliant light, materially, vitally, intellectually, and most importantly, spiritually. Ideals that express India's soul, that are relevant to this day, though their truths might have become distorted or clouded over the course of long time. Throughout the human history, the greatest minds and souls everywhere have sought to know the truth of ultimate existence, the ultimate reality. And glimpses of this truth have expressed and manifested in various forms throughout the world. But India is the only place where the memory of the eternal seeking of this truth has been preserved for millennia. It is preserved in the consciousness of this place, in the memory of its people, in the mind of its race, in the very essential physical being of this place. This is what makes India unique among all the other great civilizations of the world. This past has also given India a unique mission in the future evolutionary march of humanity. India has a uniquely distinct role to play in the world. We will speak about that in a follow-up talk to this session next week. So coming to the topic for the day, the spiritual foundations of Indian culture, I wish to begin by invoking 3 verses from Bhagavad Puran. These are interesting verses because here we meet the gods, the devas, in the heaven, singing the glory of the human birth in this land called Bharat. The gods are wondering what auspicious deeds the people of this land must have done that the divine was so pleased with them so as to grant human birth in this land of Bharat. A birth which is the means to the service of God. This is another important hint to another fundamental truth of the spiritual culture of India, that of a birth being the means to serve the divine. Essentially, it gives human life its ultimate aim, its meaning, its very purpose, that is to serve the divine. And how to serve the divine? By consecrating all life and its experience, by offering one's limited existence completely at the feet of the divine. This is how the human part in us evolves and gradually arrives at its higher nature, something which is a unique blessing given by the divine only to us humans. This is something that even gods don't have. That's the message of India. So in other words, Indian culture recognizes spirit as the truth of our being and our life as a growth and evolution of the spirit. It speaks of all life and thought as potential means of progress towards realizing the self and towards realizing the God. So let's get back to our gods and hear what else they may be saying of the human life in this land called Bharat. Now, these gods are keenly desirous to have the good fortune of being born as humans in Bharat, and they are lamenting that in the rich luxury of their heaven, they have lost the very memory of the lotus feet of Narayana, the indwelling divine. And why have they forgotten that? Because of the abundant exuberance of sense enjoyment, they say. This is another really deep insight into the spiritual culture of India and spiritual thought and practice. That is, that the unrestrained enjoyment of senses makes one forgetful of the true source, the divine, the supreme, which is essentially the origin of all abundance and prosperity in the first place. An overindulgence of senses and mind, an unbridled pursuit of pleasure, only leads to pain and misery in life. This truth has been expressed in different ways in many of our scriptures. I'll just mention a few examples. We hear of this in the story of Nachiketa in Kathopanishad, where there is a magnificent contemplation on the necessity to discern between Shreyas and Preyas, that which is good for the development of soul and that which is pleasing for our senses. Or we have in the Isha Upanishad, the second line of its very first verse, Ten tyakten bhunjitha, ma gridaha kasya svidhanam, which speaks of the need to renounce all so that one can enjoy all, and also of not to covet another's material riches. And then, of course, we have the Bhagavad Gita, which is where we have the reminder of the need for an inner tyag, renunciation not of the object of desire, but the very desire itself. And that, Indian tradition says, is the means to grow in our consciousness. This idea of growing in consciousness, the whole gradual self-development and graded progression of human individual through various stages of life, has been another key concern in Indian spiritual culture. We will not take it up in detail at this point, but one important insight from Sri Aurobindo should be sufficient for our purpose. He tells us that to develop to the full the intellectual, the dynamic and volitional, the ethical, the aesthetic, the social and economic being of man was an important element of Indian culture. If for nothing else, he adds, at least as an indispensable and preliminary to spiritual perfection and freedom. This helps us appreciate that the Indian model of human development leaves out no part of man's being or nature. This integral approach to life is an applied expression of the Vedic ideal of a progressive self-culture and intense self-discipline. In the Veda, we find constantly this image of an essentially psychological journey through life, the soul's onward and upward march on the path of knowledge and truth. The Veda speaks of the need of a heroic effort to attain an all-sided perfection. Now, this brings me to the third verse of the Bhagavad Puran that we've been discussing. Now, here the gods tell us of one other key truth of India when they say that in this pious land of Bharat, heroic souls can achieve in a moment the state of fearlessness in God by renouncing in Him all actions done by their perishable bodies. So in this one verse, we find several essential truths of yoga, of life, of all spiritual effort. Let's take a look at few of them. First, it reminds us that only the courageous, only the fearless can walk the path of yoga. As it is also said by the Rishi of Mundaka Upanishad, Nayam Atma Balhin Labhyo. The Atman or self cannot be won by one who is without strength. Then there is also the truth of renouncing all our actions in the divine, of doing all our works as sacrifice, as offering to the divine. Because then alone there is no bondage of the works. The inner being remains free of attachments or consequences of the works. And this is again mentioned in the Isha Upanishad in the second verse. Kurvan nevah karmani jijivishet shatam samaha evam tvai nanyathe tvasti nakarma lipyate nare, which Sri Aurobindo has translated as, doing verily works in this world, one should wish to live 100 years. Thus it is in thee, and not otherwise than this, action cleaves not to a man. And then of course there is the stupendous teaching of Karma Yoga as triple path of yoga given by Sri Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita, a teaching that Sri Aurobindo and the Mother remind us is yet to liberate humanity. So in just these three verses are revealed some of the fundamental spiritual truths on which Indian culture is founded. But we must go deeper and reflect on the most essential truth of the spirit that has shaped the entire superstructure of Indian culture and civilization. That truth comes to us by the rishis of the Veda, the sacred literature that we in Indian tradition speak of as Shruti, because it's the truth heard by the rishi, the Satya Shrota, the truth seen by the rishi, the Satya Drishta. The Veda, Sri Aurobindo tells us, is the bedrock of Indian civilization. Before we get to the core Vedic vision, a few words about the Veda may be in order. The Veda is the creation of an early intuitive and symbolic mentality. And Sri Aurobindo says it is an ancient psychological science and art of spiritual living. It, as we all know, is the earliest available record of the ancient body of knowledge of eternal truths that were revealed to the rishis. And these rishis were preoccupied with the quest for a self-knowledge and a profound world knowledge. This ancient Indian ideal of rishi itself is something quite unique to the Indian culture. This rishi is not a life-negating ascetic. Rather, he is someone who has lived a full life and through an intense process of self-development, risen above the lower limitations of ordinary human nature and seen, or rather realized, the supra-intellectual, the supramental or spiritual truth of existence. And because of that, he can view all things from that poise. And at the same time, he is sympathetic to the intense human effort that is required to conquer and rise above the lower human nature, he can guide the humanity from within. As Sri Aurobindo says, it is the Rishi who can guide the world humanly as God guides it divinely. Because like the divine, he is in the life of the world and yet above it. Life affirming and life transcending at the same time. And it's rather unfortunate that in modern India we have forgotten to listen to our rishis. So what is this core Vedic teaching that is at the base, at the very core of Indian spiritual culture? The Rishi of our times, Sri Aurobindo, has revealed that core Vedic vision, has summarized it for us in a few key passages. The Veda tells us that there is a supreme reality, a world or a home of truth, Sadanam Ritasya, and a plane of consciousness that is Satyam Ritam Brahat, where all is the truth, the right, the vast. In contrast to that, there is an inferior truth here of this world, which is quite mixed up with much falsehood and error, Anritasya Bhura. The Vedic rishis realized that there are many worlds between these two that go up to the highest world of truth, the highest home of truth, the great heaven. And we have to find the path to this great heaven, but it must be the path of truth, Ritasya Pantha, or the way of the gods. Another key aspect of the Vedic realization is that the self-luminous reality is essentially one, Ekam Sat. The seers worshipped this one existent supreme reality in the image of Surya, the sun, and they called him by various names, Indra, Agni, Yama, Matrishwan, etc. And that's what is revealed, that is what is expressed in the first mandala of Rig Veda, the famous line that most Indians are familiar with, Ekam Sat Vipra Bahuda Vadanti. Now the path of the truth, the Ritasya Pantha, on which the aspirant, the Aryan, must walk on, is constantly obstructed by the powers of darkness which conceal the light or which rob the light. These powers are there because of much mixing of truth and falsehood in this lower triple world of physical, vital, and mental existence. Human life is therefore a battle between the powers of light and truth and the powers of darkness and falsehood. The Veda tells us that this battle was first fought by our forefathers, Pitaro Manushya and the divine Angirasas. These forefathers had attained a great victory, which can come to us also if we follow the path of the tapasya that they have hewn for us. But it is important to note that this path is not a renunciation of life, but a path of self-giving and surrender. By constantly invoking the divine powers through sacrifice, through offering, through yagna, and birthing the gods within him, man can establish truth and light within him and attain victory over darkness and falsehood. This yagna or sacrifice is described often in the Veda as pilgrimage, travel towards the gods. And this journey is made with Agni as the path finder, as our leader. This Agni is the conscious will, the inner flame of aspiration within us. There is much deeper psychological and occult meaning to this yagna, and I want to come to that in a little bit. But before I do that, let me reiterate a couple of key points which are quite important, because failing to recognize those, failing to fully appreciate those has led to much distorted understanding of Indian culture or Indian spirituality. So the first point is the rishis of the Veda, who are in the quest of truth and immortality, are not life-negating or world-shunning ascetics. Neither the Veda nor the Upanishads deny life. Rather, they lay a full emphasis on life. The Upanishads tell us that the world is a manifestation of the eternal, which they speak of as Brahman. All here is Brahman, all is in Brahman, and Brahman is in all. The rishis, however, also affirm that the present way of existence of man is not the highest. His outward mind and life are not all his being. To attain to his self-fulfillment and self-perfection, man has to grow out of his physical and mental ignorance into spiritual self-knowledge. This growing from ignorance into spiritual self-knowledge that has been emphasized in Indian culture, however, does not obstruct in any way man's quest or attainment or pursuit in other domains of life. And here again we have an important reminder from Sri Aurobindo, where he says that while the dominant note in the Indian mind, the temperament that has been at the foundation of all its culture and originated and supported the greater part of its philosophy, religion and art and life, has been spiritual, intuitive and psychic. This fundamental tendency has not excluded, but rather powerfully supported a strong and rich intellectual, practical and vital activity. And the second point that we must remember and that must be highlighted here is this, that the Veda is not a closed book. The revelation is not a one-time event. This progressive unfolding of the truth and the constant integration of new truths has been an essential part of Indian spiritual culture. Sri Aurobindo tells us that an alert readiness to acknowledge new light, capable of enlarging the old tradition, has always been a part of the living and growing Indian spiritual culture. And then he adds, while India recognized the authority of spiritual experience and knowledge, she valued even more the need of variety of spiritual experience and knowledge. So let me go back to the Yagna for a bit more because of its significance as in its deeper inner psychological sense as a foundation of the Indian cultural and sociological vision of life and its true aim and meaning. Yagna is the original creative act of the Supreme, which is what is called as involution by Sri Aurobindo. It is through a cosmic sacrifice that the entire creative activity begins, says the Purusha Sukta of the Rig Veda. Involution is thus the process of supreme reality becoming causal, subtle and gross universe, becoming the gods, heaven and earth, life and matter, the sun, the moon and stars, animals and men. It is the process by which the indivisible unity of the spirit is sacrificed and becomes and involves itself in its exact opposite, that is the infinite fragmentation of matter. As the supreme reality descends, at every stage there is a gradual loss of consciousness of unity in outer form, which is what gives rise to the multiplicity of the forms. And this gradual loss is through a process of voluntary self-limitation of the spirit. That is the Yagna, the sacrifice of the Supreme. And at the last stage, when the spirit becomes matter, this loss is almost total. But this loss of consciousness of unity is only at the level of the outer form, not at the level of the spirit. Which is why in India we say there is divinity in matter as well, veiled but waiting to be released. At the deeper level, the unity of the Supreme Being, the Purusha, is secretly present in every level of descent, upholding and guiding the whole creative process. In the causal state of the world, we call it pragya, the divine intelligence. In the subtle as Hiranyagarbha, the golden womb, and in the gross as Virat, the universal being. So this gives us one half of the story of the Indian vision of reality. This half speaks of one becoming many and the supreme reality or the supreme being secretly hiding in each and every aspect of his manifestation. Evolution is the other half of the story. Evolution again is a yagna, Sri Aurobindo says. The sacrifice that is done with the aim of reuniting with the Supreme Source, the Spirit, which has become all the worlds, including the world of the matter, the Prithvi. So if the creative involution proceeds by a gradual loss and veiling of consciousness of unity in the individual form through the limiting mechanism of consciousness, the sacrifice of evolution proceeds by a gradual rediscovery of the conscious unity of spirit through the consequent increase and expansion of consciousness. This essential movement of evolutionary sacrifice proceeds by a denial of ego, hence the word yagna, through an act of self-giving to the universal and transcendent divine and its powers, the gods. The Veda tells us that in a cosmic order that is governed by the laws of unity and interdependence, the only right path towards evolutionary progress is through mutual self-giving or sacrifice. The human aspirant sacrifices his triple lower nature, invites the devas, the gods, to be born within him, and the gods in turn uplift the human soul so that it may someday be released out of unconsciousness to consciousness and finally into the superconsciousness. This idea of mutual self-giving between man and supreme is described beautifully by Sri Aurobindo in Savitri. A mutual debt binds man to the supreme. His nature we must put on as he put ours. We are sons of God and must be even as he. His human portion we must grow divine. Our life is a paradox with God for key. This idea of man becoming one with the divine, taking on the divine nature, is again something fundamentally unique to the Indian spiritual culture and thought. Now we see a continuation and further development of this Vedic revelation and spirit in the Upanishads, which redefined the Vedic utterances and their symbolism while keeping close to their spiritual truths. Over the long course of India's march, newer forms of expression carried on with the ever-widening dissemination of the fundamental Vedic vision, making it firmly entrenched in the consciousness of the race and giving a definite turn and stamp to the whole culture and civilization of India. Sri Aurobindo has spoken of this in a remarkable passage. He says, the Vedas and the Upanishads are not only the sufficient fountainhead of Indian philosophy and religion, but of all Indian art, poetry and literature. It was the soul, the temperament, the ideal mind formed and expressed in them which later carved out the great philosophies, built the structure of dharma, recorded its heroic youth in the Mahabharata and Ramayana, intellectualized indefatigably in the classical times of its manhood. Throughout so many original intuitions in science, created so rich a glow of aesthetic and vital and sensuous experience, renewed its spiritual and psychic experience in the Tantra and Purana, flung itself into grandeur and beauty of line and color, hewed and cast its thought and vision in stone and bronze, poured itself into new channels of expression in the later tongues, and now, after eclipse, re-emerges always the same indifference and ready for a new life and a new creation. This is essentially why we say India is a spiritual culture, because at its very core is the spiritual vision of reality, which has colored and shaped all its various aspects. And in case anyone gets the wrong notion that because of this predominant spiritual turning of the Indian temperament, other aims of life were ignored or considered less worthy, Sri Aurobindo again reminds us that that was never the case in the long history of India, where he writes, India has not only had the long role of her great saints, sages, thinkers, religious founders, poets, creators, scientists, scholars, legists, she has also had her great rulers, administrators, soldiers, conquerors, heroes, men with the strong active will, the mind that plans, and the seeing force that builds. She has warred and ruled, traded and colonized, and spread her civilization, built polities and organized communities and societies, done all that makes the outward activity of great peoples. Great people make a great culture indeed. But what essentially is this culture that we've been speaking of? And again, Sri Aurobindo has given us some valuable guidance in this regard, where he speaks of culture as an expression of the consciousness of life, which formulates itself in three aspects. The first is that of thought, ideal, upward will, and soul's aspiration, which is expressed in a people's philosophy, higher thinking, and religion. This is the soul of a people's culture. The second aspect is that of creative self-expression and an appreciative aesthesis, intelligence, and imagination, which is expressed through the arts, literature, poetry, and sciences. That is the mind of a people's culture. And the third is a side of outward and practical formulation that is expressed through various social, political, economic systems and structures that a people create to organize their outer lives. That is the body of a culture. So with this definition in mind, let us see if we can identify a few distinctive aspects of Indian culture. The first is that in India, the real driving force of the civilization has been the soul of its culture, with the mind and body following as closely as best as they can. All great movements of thought and life in India have found their beginning, their origin in some new spiritual revelation or some new religious truth. This inward orientation of Indian consciousness must never be missed if we truly wish to know and appreciate all things Indian. The next point is again quite unique to Indian culture, and that is that in India, philosophy is not merely the result of mental gymnastics or rationalistic speculation. Rather, it founds itself in the spiritual vision of her mystics. This is what Sri Aurobindo means when he says in India, philosophy has been made dynamic by religion. It also means that there is no inherent incompatibility between a true intellectual and a spiritual quest. Rather, the two can be complementary. Indian wisdom holds that a truly purified intellect and a calm mind can become the doorway into the realm of the spirit. Related to this is the point that in India, religion has also been enlightened by philosophy. A constant stream of spiritual masters and mystics, kathavachaks and sadhus, and an ever-growing system of religious forms and practices have helped the commonest Indian acquire at least a lived sense of some of the profoundest spiritual truths. The word that is most appropriate to help us understand the Indian outlook on religion is dharma, an all-encompassing, harmonizing principle which is at the very foundation of all life. If the quest for the infinite is the major chord of Indian culture, Sri Aurobindo says, dharma, the idea of dharma, is right behind it. This explains why the only name the Indian mind gave to its religio-spiritual culture was Sanatana Dharma, the eternal dharma. And in a remarkable passage, Sri Aurobindo has described this. Indian religio-spiritual culture, he says, gave itself no name because it set itself no sectarian limits. It claimed no universal adhesion, asserted no infallible dogma, set up no single narrow path or gate of salvation. It was less a creed or cult than a continuously enlarging tradition of the Godward endeavor of the human spirit. An immense, many-sided, many-staged provision for a spiritual self-building and self-finding. It had some right to speak of itself by the only name it knew, the eternal religion, the Sanatana Dharma. So the whole life of an individual and society was to be organized in a manner so that one would naturally grow in dharma. An attempt was made to steer the whole of life towards an aspiration for something beyond the physical, vital, and mental existence. Finally, Indian culture has never ignored the material and economic prosperity. Our sages have given us the scheme of Purusharthas, which encourages a harmonious pursuit of the goals of artha and kama in the light of the dharma. But the unchecked pursuit of artha and kama must be given up in man's quest for growing in dharma, for growing in spirit. So we thus see that the Indian cultural tradition maintains firmly that the Vedic vision is the foundation and basis of India's spiritual culture, and it has also been the guiding force behind all India's inner and outer development. But this view is almost always left out when Indian history is taught in our schools and colleges. The picture of India's past that is often given is that throughout her long journey, India was merely a passive field, activated primarily by the infiltration of invading groups. And whatever might have been the view of reality or life in the Vedic times, it is no longer relevant today or tomorrow, and is rather a remnant of some barbaric, primitive, infra-rational past which must be discarded in the name of rational progress. I bring this point because it's important for our purpose here, because the mother herself had expressed in a conversation in February 1973 a need for rewriting books on history, particularly Indian history, in the light of Sri Aurobindo. She had said this to Professor Kittu Reddy, a long-time teacher of Indian history and culture at Sri Aurobindo International Center for Education, and he has recounted this conversation with the mother in his book on Indian history. Part of the reason why Indian history misses out on this, capturing this essential spirit of India, is because of the way history is commonly written. And here again we can use an insight from Sri Aurobindo, who has described this idea of how history is commonly written, where he says that rulers, people and thinkers alike have understood by their national existence a political status, the extent of their borders, their economic well-being and expansion, their laws, institutions and workings of these things. For this reason, political and economic motives have everywhere predominated on the surface, and history has been a record of their operations and influence. But there must be a more subjective, a more inward oriented approach to understand and write the history of India, especially because the Indian people are subjective in their very approach to life. This inwardness is one of the striking aspects of Indian temperament. And one of the most powerful subjective forces in history has been that of the individual. Kittu Reddy in his book reminds us that there have been times in the history of Indian nation where events have revolved around an individual personality. We in India have given these personalities names such as Avatar, Vibhuti, Rishi, Sant, etc. These are the ones who have led the evolutionary march of consciousness and opened a new way for the humanity to progress on all levels: physical, vital, mental, psychic, and spiritual. The impact of such inner subjective forces in shaping the outer history of India must become the basis for our understanding of India and her cultural past, present, and future. Now, there is an essay titled March of Civilisations by Nalinikant Gupta, where he has summarized this inner spiritual history of India, which has divided naturally into some great movements with their corresponding epochs. And each of these epochs has dwelt, or rather dealt with, one domain in the hierarchy of man's consciousness. So he's listed these epochs as Vedic, Upanishadic, the age of darshanas, Puranic, the age of bhakti, and finally the tantric. Now here is a caution that he tells us that we must keep in mind, that we must not understand that the last, that's the tantric stage, is some latest revelation or is something that is nearest to us in time. It has been there all along as a complementary movement, and it is one in which the other movements, spiritual movements, find their fruition and consummation. So let's see how the spiritual movement has been explained by Nalinikant Gupta. He says, what was revealed to the rishis of the Veda through their occult vision and will came to the Upanishadic rishis through the force of intuition. And as the philosophical outlook grew and rational understanding and discursive argumentation became the dominant mode of conveying and expressing the truth, it gave rise to the age of darshanas, the systems of philosophy, starting from the Buddha and reaching its peak in Shankaracharya. Next is the Puranic stage. That is when the vital being of man is touched by the light of the spirit, especially on its highest, the mental domain. And that's when the element of feeling, imagination, and emotion start to become leading note in man's quest for the spirit. This element of feeling and emotion as predominant note in man's spiritual quest comes to its vibrancy and becomes more concrete in the age of bhakti, where the entire emotional being is taken up. So what remains is the physical, the most material layer that needs to be worked upon and made conscious and made illumined. That is the work of the tantric discipline, which bases itself upon the nature power that is coiled in matter and the release of that all-conquering force through a process of purification and opening into the consciousness of the Divine Mother is the work of the tantric discipline. So the true march of India, as we have seen, has been an intense inner and spiritual movement. It has been dealing with man's very nature and seeking to know it and shape it consciously. This is how we must understand the true inner history of Indian culture and Indian civilization, the true spiritual movement that has shaped the entire culture, thought, and life of India. This understanding will awaken us to the future march of India as a nation soul. There is a deeply moving passage of Sri Aurobindo where we find a great reminder of the work that lies ahead for India. The history of tamasic nations, says Sri Aurobindo, is a record of material impacts thrown out from the organism or suffered by it. Its life is measured by the duration of dynasties or outward forms of government. The history of Rajasic nations is a bundle of biographies where the individual predominates. But the history of Sattvic nations would be the story of the universal human self in its advance to knowledge and Godhead. In that passage, I'm skipping few lines and then he continues, and until Sattva is fully evolved, the community will try to preserve all the useful forces and institutions gathered by the past social evolution, neither destroying them nor leaving them intact, but rather harmonizing and humanizing them by the infusion of a higher ideal and vivifying them from time to time by a fresh review in the light of new experience and wider knowledge. The Sattvic nation will avoid the dead conservatism of tamasic communities. It will avoid the restless progress of Rajasic nations. It will endeavor to arrive at a living and healthy stability, high, calm, and peaceful, in which man may pursue undisturbed his nobler destiny. From the glorious dawns of our civilization, which gave a strong spiritual foundation to the Indian way of life, to the new challenge and promise of future noons, which will facilitate man's ascent so that he can fulfill God's dream on the earth and transform earthly life into a life divine. This is the true story of India's civilizational march, her unique and great culture, and her future destiny. As I come near to the end of this lecture, I wish to mention that through this series of talks and lectures organized under the banner India on the March project that is undertaken by Sakar, much light will be thrown on various aspects of Indian culture at the levels of soul, mind, and body. This year-long series will help us gain valuable insight into various facets of the true genius of India, so that we all, the sons and daughters of India, and all the lovers of India and her rich spiritual culture, wherever they are, can confidently walk on the multi-directional yet one-pointed path toward a true renaissance of India, as envisioned by Sri Aurobindo and the Mother. That will be our participation in the collective yoga of Indian nation. As Sri Aurobindo tells us, India rises not for her sake alone, but for the sake of the humanity, of the whole world. Are we ready to offer all our works, our spiritual effort, and the whole of our being into the inner Yagna, that is the true force behind the outer march of India? So let me conclude with Sri Aurobindo's words, which I believe perfectly capture the core of the glorious past of Indian spiritual culture, one that will also be the true basis of her even more glorious future. He writes, "The spiritual motive will be in the future of India, as in her past, the real originative and dominating strain. By spirituality, we do not mean a remote metaphysical mind or the tendency to dream rather than to act. That was not the great India of old in her splendid days of vigor, and it will not be the India of the future. Namaste.